there was so much beautiful old architectural stuff that was just tossed out and on a heap. And there were several people who went around and collected and saved that. And a lot of them ended up making frames out of it. And so my next door neighbor at the time, that was something that she quit being a lawyer for a while to do that. So, Katrina made us all sort of reevaluate what we were doing and how we were spending our lives.
So tell me, how long have you lived in New Orleans?
Well, I'm a native New Orleanian, and I went to college elsewhere.
Where'd
And
you go to college?
the California Institute of the Arts in Los Angeles.
Ooh.
I was at the Walt Disney School. It was really great fun. And I discovered early on that I really got the same charge out of cooking and food as I did from theater. And so this has been a much happier and successful experience. And it's kind of funny to me how things come full circle, because now that I host Louisiana Eats, I'm using both. It's all right there. So
So explain a little bit about that, the theater and the culinary background, and how that comes together. What is it that charges you in those environments?
Well, I think that food is the great uniter. It's the thing that makes us all human. It doesn't matter what race or religion or creed, we all have to eat to live. And the table is the place we all come together. And there's a lot of theater that takes place at your dinner table. Goodness knows, when I found my path as a cooking teacher, I realized that I was kind of on stage. And I'm very, very lucky in that I can talk and cook at the same time. And so it's just been a perfect life for me.
So I wanted to ask a few questions about pre-Katrina, and in particular the food scene then, and your thoughts about what it was like 11, 12, 15 years ago in New Orleans in terms of the culinary scene.
Well, forgive the Rouse's employees while they shout. Um, Before Katrina, really, we just celebrated this past weekend the 20th anniversary of the Crescent City Farmers Market. And it was the Crescent City Farmers Market that really began to change and turn things around here locally. New Orleans is a city that's renowned for food. And we also really love our traditional old restaurants, our traditional old ways of cooking things. You go back to the 70s, and Paul Prudhomme, who we just lost, of course, created the first American fusion cuisine and was really the first American chef. Having grown up in the country, he already realized that farm to table was the most natural thing in the world. So Paul got that going over at Commander's, and they were purchasing local, and they had huge purchasing power over there. However, what had happened also in the 70s was that the old French market, which was one of the most vital food markets that ever existed and is the oldest city market in America, that market began as a water market in 1718, where people were just tying up to the levee and selling whatever they had to sell. The French market by the 1970s was in bad physical shape. The buildings were sort of decrepit, and in what I think is questionable wisdom, the city government decided to change the French market. And the French market changed from being a food market, a vibrant food market, to being one big t-shirt shop, which was incredible disappointment to all of us natives. So the farmers had gone. The farmers had gone back. Most of the farming had moved already in the 60s as the property values increased in New Orleans. The farming moved to the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain. And they were mostly selling, they were at the mercy of grocery store jobbers. And my dear friend Richard McCarthy had a vision and a great hunger for arugula. And he and John Aberjan and Sharon Litwin got together and decided they were going to figure out a way to have a farmer's market. And so the Crescent City Farmers Market was born 20 years ago. And it took Richard a lot of persuasion to get those farmers back to the city that they perceived as being dangerous and no place where they wanted to be. But once they came and they had the market experience and saw how immediately embraced they were by the community, not only of just housewives, market shoppers, but the chefs. It was the great chef tie-up that had been waiting to happen. So our farm-to-table movement spread rapidly once the Crescent City Farmers Market opened up. And farmers began growing special crops for chefs. And so the food scene in New Orleans was very, very, very vibrant even then. And it's just changed a little since the storm. It's changed a lot, but it's had to do with geography, kinds of food. There's lots of things that have changed. But I can't really say that I think New Orleans is better or worse in the food department now than before the storm.
So tell me a little bit about during and post Katrina, because I know that you were involved in reestablishing the Crescent City Farmers Market. I know that you were involved in maintaining the foodways and methods in the city, and you have a wall behind you of awards that you have received. Heroes of the New South and
Oh, Carlo Petrini, the slow food founder from Italy, Carlo Petrini. The Carlo Petrini Leadership Award, and when the Times-Picayune named me Hero of the Storm, it just about shocked me because, I don't know, my motivation was just to somehow fix things in this city that had been turned so upside down in the things that were important to me. And, when the storm happened, I ended up, like many people, with relatives in Baton Rouge, and we were kind of isolated there, and we were all dying to get back to the city, and there was me and my computer, and I'll never forget sort of the way that the whole thing started. Richard McCarthy, my dear friend, I was on the Farmers Market Board by then. He and his wife and their daughter had gone to Houston because their daughter she was in middle school and she had to go to school. And Darlene Walnick, who was Richard's second-hand or right-hand person, Darlene was in Cleveland where her family is. And so in essence, I was the person closest to having the boots on the ground. And the first thing that we did, I had this conversation with Richard, and Richard was so sad, and he just said, Poppy, he said, our food system is so broken. It's so broken now. Those words really stayed with me. And one of the first things that we set out to do was find our vendors and see what kind of condition they were in, who needed what, and just gathering those people up alone was very hard, in particular our seafood vendors. And the thing that really changed everything, there is a family, the Brandhurst family, Kay and Ray Brandhurst, he's a multi-generational shrimper. And they had a seafood store in Chalmette, and they lived down in Chalmette. They lost their house, they lost their store, his boat sunk. They had 4 children. Kay evacuated to Shreveport, where her nephew had an apartment. She was crammed into an apartment with all the kids, and Ray was trying to get the boat raised and trying to get the motors fixed, and it was really a very trying time. And I got an email from Kay describing those very things. And at the end of the email, she said, but don't worry, this shrimp girl is coming back. I had been very involved with the slow food movement since it first came to the United States. I'd started one of the first 10 chapters here in New Orleans. And slow food is all about working with food producers to make sure they get a fair price for their food, that making sure you know where your food comes from. And so I started hearing from my slow food friends all across the US. And they said, "What can we do to help?" And I was so befuddled at that point that what I started doing was just sending them Kay's email and saying, "Read this, and you tell me what you can do to help, because I don't have a clue how to fix this." And the most amazing thing happened. The slow food chapters all across the United States began to have red beans and rice parties and gumbo parties and fundraisers. And I'll never forget the chapter in Monterey Bay literally adopted the Brandhursts and got the motors fixed and helped them financially get rolling again. So all this money begins to pour into Slow Food USA up in New York. And one of Carlo Petrini's visionary projects is something he calls Terra Madre, which of course is Mother Earth. This is something that it's a biannual event that happens in Milan, where he brings the food producers and chefs and slow food folks all together for 5 days of talking, problem solving, looking at the issues. And so I said, okay, I'll do this. I'll help you with this Katrina thing, but we're not going to name it Katrina because I don't even want to hear that name. We're going to call it after Carlo's visionary idea. We're going to call it the Terra Madre Relief Fund. And so that's what we did. We raised a great deal of money, all with the commitment to get that money into the food producers' hands so they could get producing again. And it wasn't just about farmers. One of the best spent dollars that I ever watched circulating, I didn't have a personal relationship before the hurricane with the Bracata family. I had eaten their delicious pastries my entire life, but I didn't know them personally. Well, they had just celebrated their centennial right before the storm, and they had finally lost their grandfather clause by upgrading their entire facility. Well, there was 4+ feet of water that sat in Bracatas for a couple of weeks at least. And the Bracatas were in Houston, and they were thinking of not coming home. They were thinking of opening a business maybe in Baton Rouge, maybe in Houston. And another dear friend of mine, Dana Logston, who's sort of a obsessive baker person and researcher, Dana got in touch with me and she said, "We've got to do something about this." So we got in touch with the Bracatas. They probably thought we were crazy. But Dana and her mother at that time had a bakery down in the Marigny called La Spiga. And they were Crescent City Farmers Market vendors also. Well, because Dana had small kids, and both Dana and her mom's house were completely wiped out, Dana, her mom, and Dana's kids were in Baton Rouge so the kids could go to school. So they were only able to operate their bakery, I think maybe 3 days a week at that time. But the bakery was in perfect shape, untouched because of where it was. And so we reached out to the Bracatas. We sat down in La Spiga and all met each other for the first time. And we said, look, here's the deal. New Orleans needs to get our Italian cookies back. We need these cookies back before St. Joseph's Day in March of 2006. So you guys have got to get into production. And so what we did was the Bracatas began using La Spiga when La Spiga wasn't open, and the Terra Madre relief dollars went to the Bracatas, who then used it to pay rent. So it was the money passed seamlessly from one hand to another, and two family businesses benefited greatly, all from the same dollar. And it really was one of the most amazing things when all of a sudden on the grocery store shelves, there were the bags of cuchinadas. There were the bags of sesame cookies. Because when the groceries reopened in late October of 2005, because I was back living in the city by the first week of October. As soon as Rita passed, I came back and I was here. And the first time I got into a grocery store, up on a top shelf, there were all these brocado cookies. And I knew what had happened. And I thought, oh my God, these could be the last Brocatas cookies I ever see. So I bought them all, like a PIG. And when I got the packages home, there was a little label on the back of each one of the packages, and it said, Best, B-E-S-T, by, B-Y, August, A-U-G, '05. And I looked at that label and I thought, dear God, this could possibly be true of all of us. We might have all been Best by August 2005. And I had this long-running joke with my friend Jessica Harris that we really should go get the tattoo. And she thought we were going to do it, but I assure you, we don't have a tattoo.
No. So, I mean, Angela Brocata's is amazing. I remember going by and getting cannolis, freshly made shells with fresh cream and whatever. I wanted chocolate or I wanted the regular cream or I wanted a little bit of both.
What if we didn't have them after 100 years?
Amazing to-order kind of work as well.
And they still do. It's back like it was, and it's beautiful, and they're hugely successful. There's always a line out the door, and that was one little piece. There was something else really remarkable that happened in that time period that I think speaks so much to how people really are in the world today. And that is that there was also a citrus farmer who was on the west bank of the Mississippi River. So he didn't have any flood. It was on the east bank, forgive me. He was on the east bank, and they had no flooding. And they had a bumper crop of citrus that year before the storm hit. Well, when the storm hit, it blew all the leaves off the citrus trees, and it left at least half the fruit. So they had a great deal of fruit to sell, but they had absolutely no way to sell it. They had no phone, they had no way to accept credit cards, they had nothing. When the Crescent City Farmers Market reopened, Richard McCarthy and I used to call it was the happiest day in New Orleans because we got that market open the Tuesday before Thanksgiving in November of '05. And it was one of the most cathartic, incredible experiences because none of us, we all lost each other. Nobody knew where anybody went. And so you went to the market and there were your neighbors and your friends, and you suddenly found out where everybody was and and how they made out, as we would say, in the storm. So the La host told me about their citrus issue and how were they going to sell all this citrus. Well, again, through Slow Food USA, we sent out nationally from the New York office an email saying that for Christmas, for $25, you could get a box of satsumas and navel oranges delivered to your door, and you would also be helping the citrus farmers stay in business. And so with that, the orders began pouring in. And because I was crazy back at that fall, as everybody was who lived here, I said, oh, I'll process the orders because Linda can't receive them. She doesn't have internet access. So all the orders poured through my computer, and I would print out the orders, and then I would bring the printed orders to Linda La host, and she would then turn around, pack the boxes, and ship them. However, she had no way of accepting payment by credit card. There was no mail. The mail was spotty at best. And so Linda shipped all hundreds of boxes of citrus on the promise from the slow food folks who were buying them that the check was in the mail. Every single check arrived. Everybody paid. And it helped them stay in business, and it was just an enormous, enormous thing.
So it's really kind of amazing to me the amount of economic diversity and the way in which the economic programs that sort of just generated as a result of you sending out emails to the slow food organization around the US. People just figured out how to make this work.
Yeah.
When there was a need, they just figured out the economics. They didn't have to follow a model. There wasn't anything the slow food organization already had in place. The individual units just
We just made it up as we went along. That was like everything that happened in New Orleans back in 2005. We were just making it up as we went along, because I always tell people, I think that we lived through the closest thing to a nuclear explosion that I hope to ever experience in this lifetime, because the city, I mean, there were no children, there were no birds, there was nothing green. Everything was brown and gray and dirty, and it was a very disturbing place to drive around in, because everywhere you went, there was a water line. And over and over again, you'd sit at the stoplight and you'd go, wow, the water would have been over my head here, which is a really weird thing to be thinking all the time. It's amazing that we all made it through, most of us.
So why do you want to stay? I mean, living like that, knowing that that could happen. Why did you want to stay?
I had absolutely no choice. This is my city. This is my place. I knew that this city was going to survive, because it always has survived. And so there was no choice. There wasn't any place else I wanted to be. There wasn't any place else I wanted to go. I had no choice. This is my spot. And I know that people do live elsewhere, but I don't know why and I don't know how.
So if you would, tell me a little bit more about the places that came back with your assistance. So you mentioned Angela Brocata's. I know that there are several other family bakeries, family restaurants.
Well, the other...
Patsy the horse is mentioned in an article. Patsy carried the Roman candy wagon.
Patsy the mule. She's a
mule.
Sorry. New Orleans is fortunate enough to have one last mule-drawn street vendor who is original from Ronnie Cotman's grandpa's time in 1910. Roman candy is kind of a taffy that is made right on the wagon, and the wagon's pulled by a mule, and you see it all over uptown New Orleans. Well, unfortunately, Patsy had been sent to the country because the hurricane had removed the roof from her stable. Only in New Orleans would you find, right smack dab in the middle of uptown New Orleans, a mule stable. It was the last one that I knew of. And so Patsy was in exile, and Ronnie was pulling the cart around with a truck. It was the saddest thing I ever saw. And so I went to Ronnie, and I'm like, we got to get the mule back. We need the visual. We need this thing. And so some of the money that we raised went to put the roof back on the stable so that Patsy could come home and pull the Roman candy wagon around again. And then probably the most important business that I worked with and helped was Dookie Chase Restaurant. Because after the storm, I saw Leah and her daughters, Leah Chase, they were over in, what's the name of the town? Where were they? Abbeville. I took a drive over to Abbeville. No, it was Brobridge. Sorry. So in December of 2005, I went on a little trek to have a lunch with Leah and her daughters in Brobridge, Louisiana, which is between Baton Rouge and Lafayette. And Leah was dying to get home, and she was dying to get everything fixed up. But the entire family had lost all their homes. There had been 4 feet of water in the bar. The entire restaurant was covered with mold. There was the horrible walk-in situation. It was a nightmare. And they had insurance money, but the mold remediation basically sucked all the insurance money that was available. And it was right around the time that that happened that it was discovered that the floodwaters that had sat in Dookie Chase restaurant it was almost like the pipes had been through a tsunami. And so all the pipes under the slab of the kitchen were completely messed up, and the floor needed to be dug up, and it was just an enormously expensive project. But it was Leah Chase, arguably the most important person in the Creole food scene of New Orleans for the past 100 years. It had to get done. And so John Folse came to help. Jay Nix from Parkway Bakery came to help. We all just pitched in. Ashley Graham, who was a friend who was with Share Our Strength at that time, she had begun to organize through Share Our Strength what they called Hinges of Hope tours. Danny Meyer sent his people to work at Dookie Chase Restaurant. Waves of volunteers came, and fine, it took us a long time. It was almost 2 years before Leah finally got the restaurant open again. But we got that restaurant open again, and that most important spot where all the presidents have eaten, where President Obama sat down before he was president to a bowl of gumbo, and Leah, in her inimitable way, said to him, "Mr. Obama," when he picked up the Tabasco bottle, "you do not put hot sauce on my gumbo until you taste it first." What would we do without Dookie Chase Restaurant, a place where something like that could go on?
So these are really great stories of triumph over difficulty and pulling together what are pieces of New Orleans that are very meaningful to you and other New Orleanians who've been here before. What are you seeing that's new now? What is it about New Orleans now that excites you, that gets you going and just revs you up?
Well, New Orleans is a completely surprising place now, post-Katrina. First of all, I think we have over double the number of restaurants. We've doubled it, okay? So the restaurant scene has exploded. Also, because there was so much focus on the city, there were a lot of very smart, very young, ambitious people who almost saw this as their crusade. And they came to New Orleans, and boy, once you come to New Orleans once, it's hard not to stay. And so they started pouring into the city. A lot of them were food people. So now what has happened is, in New Orleans, there are neighborhoods, Freret Street in uptown New Orleans as one example. The Bywater, my goodness, the Bywater, filled with new restaurants, people doing food that we'd never had here before, different kinds of Asian food, different kinds of all sorts of exotic food. I mean, my goodness, Filipino food, incredible things, and that never existed before the storm. It's far from just another poor boy shop in New Orleans now. There's incredible diversity, and there's unbelievable mental energy going towards creating this exciting new culinary scene.
Is there anything you want people to know about New Orleans? Because, there's kind of a perception of, Katrina hit them really hard and people are staying there. I think you mentioned some of the aspects, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to speak directly to people who really are like, I just don't get it, why people would stay there.
Well, all that I can say to that is, if you don't get it, it's because you've never been here. So now is the time to come. Come to New Orleans, and you will discover one of the most magical places, not just in the United States, but in the whole world. Because the sensation for someone coming from the Midwest or someone coming from far away without any orientation to this kind of a place, You're going to feel like somebody's going to ask you for your passport the whole time you're here because it's like you've gone to another country. And it's a really magical country, and it's a really delicious place to live. So, anybody who wonders why New Orleans should still be here, just come visit us once and you'll be back.